interesting topics for discussion, primarily for our early career researcher members. So this talk, as an opening to the series, is very much geared towards our early career research. And oops, it's not advancing. There we go. So the aims of the talk are really sort of twofold. I mean, number one is to help inform career decisions early in the journey. I think for all senior academics who've sort of been along this journey do recognise that there's obviously some really important decisions that need to be made about the direction of travel for a career, the topics of study, the place that people will work, etc., etc. And I just thought it'd be helpful in some ways to inform those decisions that early career researchers are making, to provide a somewhat biased view of where I think personally the academic world will be vis-a-vis brain health and dementia research in the next 5 to 10 years, because it stands to reason that if you're mapping out a journey, it's not a bad idea to have some idea of what the destination of that journey could or should be. And the other thing to maybe help do that is to share some of my own sort of personal career experiences. I'm not going to walk through my entire CV and the last sort of 25 years of my life, but I will have a series of, dare say, personal reflections about some of the things I think are important when making some big decisions early in your career. And I think the final thing is, and we're not going to really discuss this much this evening, but it is to highlight that through particularly the work that Sophie and Louise Ritchie have been doing, is we really are here as an SDRC executive and senior leaders to help support early career researchers. So after this meeting, and I think there's a series of meetings that we're going to be having over the next few weeks, if there are other things that the early career researchers think we can do to help, either now or sort of planning out the future, please let us know, and virtually guarantee we will do it. So first off, a little bit about SDRC. I don't want to assume that everybody knows exactly what the Scottish Dementia Research Consortium is or does, is for, and also the Early Career Researcher Programme. Secondly, personal background and reflections, which hopefully won't take too long. And then, like I said, a one-man view of where I think the direction of travel is in terms of brain health and dementia research, and some of the issues therein. And I'm sure that virtually everybody at some point in this presentation is going to really violently disagree with me, and that's okay. So, Scottish Dementia Research Consortium, established about 10, 11 years ago. It sits within Alzheimer's Scotland, which is the governance body that hosts the Scottish Dementia Research Consortium. It's a membership-based organisation. We have, I think, somewhere in the region of 500-600 members. Over recent years, we've seen that membership increase quite dramatically, and in particular with researchers and early career researchers in particular. Historically, we've been obviously open to membership across people living with dementia, carers, any organisations and individuals. It's an open membership, but we have, I think, been deliberately targeting early career researchers over the last couple of years. Within the membership and within the senior leadership team, all 4 higher educational institutions are represented. And the main things the SDRC is trying to do is showcase our outputs from a Scottish research community perspective. And that showcasing can be both external to the outside world, which may help show the strength of Scottish dementia and brain health research, to help grants to other inward investment, but also internal outputs. So there's a lot of collaborations that have been established after the conferences that we've done, after the webinar, presentations, etc., because people get to know other people in the Scottish community and reach out to them to collaborate and actually deliver some outputs. We support research. I mean, we're not a grant awarding body, but we have over recent years been able to give small amounts of money to early career researchers, either for sort of small pilot projects, but also, as you know, more recently we were able to secure £50,000 of funding from Brain Health Scotland to help give small grants to help people who were struggling directly as a consequence of COVID. And there have been many large grant applications where the SDRC have been able to give administrative and other resources to help pull those grants together. Our outputs, we have an annual report, which there's a copy of the front cover of the most recent report, an annual conference. We have developed, as you know, the Early Career Researcher Programme, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. And I'm glad to say that in February next year, we'll publish the first Scottish Brain Health and Dementia Research Strategy. That really emerged on the basis of recognising the strengths we had in Scotland, organically developed over many years in brain health and dementia research. And we felt that if we were to take an even more strategic approach to some of our research outputs and research delivery, we could go even further with that and have greater impact. So there's been several meetings of various groups, and I won't list them all here, but the three key priorities that will be in the strategy for the first strategy, which will run from 21 to 23, is, and I'm not going to go into the detail of how we're going to achieve these things, but trust me, there is a very sort of action-orientated series of plans that we have. Developing enabling infrastructures for research delivery. Number 2, creating an environment between practice and research that facilitates rapid translation of research into practice. And thirdly, and maybe of most interest to this audience, is we're going to look at mechanisms to promote and resource early career researchers' career developments, but particularly at the point from postdoctoral researchers trying to find independent funding and grants to become principal investigators and group leads. The output of the Scottish Dementia Research Consortium, or dare say the outputs of the Scottish Dementia Research community, can be measured in various ways. One is, of course, academic publications, where we're reasonably strong. International collaborations, you have the eagle eyes to be able to read this, but in essence, we collaborate on papers and grants and outputs with virtually every part of the world, predominantly England and the European Union. What surprised me when we did this first report was actually the scale of activity as measured by grant income. So these are grants that are held in Scotland, not just where we're collaborators with grants held elsewhere. And you can see that we average about £25 million of grant income around dementia and brain health research a year. I think it would be anticipated that that grant income will probably drop through 2020 and 2021 for obvious reasons. But you can see that as a body of researchers, we are attracting quite significant amounts of grant income for our work. So at the beginning of this year, of course, we were obviously quite dramatically affected by the COVID pandemic, and there was a lot of feedback that we were all receiving, I guess, as supervisors and as academic leads about the impact this was having, particularly on early career researchers. So I think in March, we pulled together a survey to really try and collate as much information as possible about what those impacts were, both in the short, medium and long term. And in doing so, we took these survey data back into the executive and pulled together a series of actions, some of which were directly related to the COVID pandemic, but others developed more broadly. And this was the resource programme that we've been putting in place, I guess, over the last several months. And many of the ECR's early career researchers on the call will be involved in the mentorship programme. There have been internships advertised, particularly with Terry Quinn at the University of Glasgow. We put some online content together. There was the bridge funding I mentioned, which was this £50,000, which we'd hope to repeat in the months and years ahead. So in some ways, what we were actioned to do from the survey, we've completed most of those, if not all of them. And the one thing we haven't yet been able to achieve is the ambassador programme. And that's our title for basically giving grants to early career researchers to travel to international conferences, etc., to showcase their work. We often know that from grants, the travel budgets can be somewhat limited, even more so now with the difficulties financially from COVID. So we will have a pot of money which we can help early career researchers to continue to travel and engage at international conferences. So this is the webinar series, hot off the press. What we wanted to do with the webinar programme was balance it between specific topics of interest, and this webinar programme will run hopefully every year indefinitely, So we wanted to have some specific topics of interest, and then if you like more generic or more practical presentations as well. So this year or next year through 2020-21, we've got a lecture from Emma Stevenson, who's Professor of Nutrition and Physical Health at the University of Newcastle. We've got Alison McCulloch from the University of Edinburgh, who's going to talk to us about delirium. We've got Atticus Ainsworth and Patrick Kehoe from King's College and Bristol, respectively, to talk about vascular impairment. Hot topic at the moment is remote assessment, and we've got colleagues from Australia, Rennie Stolwick, Wendy Kielso and Karen Pike to talk about that. And Willie Stewart hasn't yet confirmed a date, but he'll talk about traumatic brain injury, and obviously world leaders, each of them in their field. But I know that early career searchers not only want to gain knowledge about certain topics, but they also want to learn some generic skills or get experiences. I'm going to talk, I guess, today about horizon scanning. We've got Terry is going to give a presentation about grant writing, and he's sharing the platform with Richard Oakley, who's the new head of research at the Alzheimer's Society. So they're going to be talking about how to write good grant applications. And I'm sure Richard or Rich will also talk a little bit about the current state of play in terms of grant funding within the UK and elsewhere. Getting published, a very good presentation some of you may have heard before from Alan Carson, again at the University of Edinburgh, does a great presentation. He's an editor with JNNP. And then colleague and friend Anna Borthwick is going to be giving a presentation about media training, and hopefully going to get a couple of journalists along to that as well to talk about their experience and what makes good sort of scientific media outputs. So that's SDRC, that's what we're doing, that's what we're up to, that's what we're going to do in the near future. And like I said at the beginning, anything you think we can do differently or better, or any ideas you have, please don't hesitate to be in touch. Like I said, the aims of the talk were twofold: to help inform career decisions early in the journey, and to outline and discuss how SDRC can help careers develop in the aftermath of this presentation. So, personal background and reflections. This is where I probably should have a little glass of whiskey, Frank. I think in some ways, when I've, what have I been doing? I started doing research in goodness me, this is going to make me feel really old. 1994 was when I first published my first academic paper, which was an observation that I made, which when I was working as a psychiatry trainee at the Royal Free in London, that it seemed to me that all the nursing staff and allied health professionals were calling all of my patients clients. And that was something I didn't really understand. For some reason, I had quite a visceral reaction to it. So I did a sort of a survey, if you like, of 100 odd people who attended an outpatient clinic at the Royal Free with various mental health difficulties. And lo and behold, the vast majority of these individuals preferred the term patient, and published that in the BJ Psych Bulletin. But I think what that highlighted was probably something that everybody who works with me knows. I'm deeply cynical about the present. I think to be a good academic, one has to really not take anything at face value as it stands, if you like, from a scientific or from a variety of different perspectives. Because if we were to, dare say, accept the status quo, that in some ways is counterintuitive to progress. If we accept that what we're doing, for instance, and I'm obviously a psychiatrist, if we thought that what we were doing for and with our patients with Alzheimer's disease was absolutely perfect, and we had no cynicism about the quality of care that we were providing, then we'd be stuck. So I think you need to have a deep cynicism about what's going on around about you currently. But that's balanced, I guess, about having huge optimism about the future. That there is a potential, there's an opportunity with endeavour, with good inquiry, with good collaborations, that you can make a difference, that things can change, if you like. And what I've done in red there is, so the black text is my observations, and in some ways the red is the actions that one can take. So it's very important, I think, to say, well, if you're hugely optimistic about the future, what are you gearing towards? What are your personal goals and your values? Now, if your personal goals and your values about the future are to generate X number of papers, or to bring in, Y number of grant applications, or to see your career progress through the stages, then that will certainly help set you on a particular course. But if your values and your aspirations are maybe to have impact or improve well-being or to discover X or discover Y, then you may follow a different course and not necessarily be so tethered to academic output from a traditional sense. Now, I know, and I'll come back to this later, that's very difficult in this day and age because it is very much a metric-driven environment that we live in. The other thing that I think about is that nothing is binary and nothing is fully known. Your science, when you think about it, across any discipline, is accepting that we know very little about the natural world round about us. If we assume that we know more than we do, then we make mistakes. And I think there's often, and this is why I say doctors make the worst academics, is because doctors like to pretend that we know what is happening, because we like to be able to communicate certainty to our patients. Now, while that's useful maybe in clinical practice, it can actually be really quite damaging in a research sense. And I think one only has to think about how stuck we've been from a scientific perspective on the way we conceptualize Alzheimer's disease around amyloid and tau and being a disease of older people, etc., to see how those, if you like, legacy issues have really held us back. They may be helpful from a clinical perspective, so I maybe argued not so helpful, but they may be helpful from a clinical perspective, but they really do hamper scientific development. I think the other thing to recognize is that there isn't any such thing as a breakthrough. Breakthroughs only happen in the Daily Mail. In science, it is a very slow, incremental, sometimes almost unobservable increase in knowledge. And I think it's important to recognize and not to foster a sense of disappointment when your careers, your output seem to be moving forward at a very glacial rate. I mean, that is actually a very secure and meaningful rate of change rather than sort of lumping around from breakthrough to breakthrough, which you'll probably find were actually not as valid as one may have thought. Now, this is where I'm probably going to get into a lot of trouble, but I think that the existing academic structure is deeply flawed, perhaps even broken. And the more I think about these things, and these are probably reflections I'm allowed to have as I get a little bit older and a little bit more, even more cynical, is that when one looks at all the academic processes, be it the slavish following of age factors and impact factors, the R&D governance systems, the ethics committees, etc., I cannot help but think that the processes actually work against the objectives. So what I mean by that is the objective of scientific inquiry has to be knowledge. It has to be generating new knowledge, which has an impact on whatever human or animal or ecological society or setting we're seeking to impact upon. But if the processes that are in place actually inhibit our ability to develop knowledge, then maybe we should be looking at those processes. And I think this is particularly true in clinical research. And what I'd ask early career researchers to do, who are maybe not as bitter and twisted as I am, is to maybe start to think and challenge some of the assumptions that we take for granted. Now, I'm going to throw it out there and ask people, why do we actually need ethics committees? Why do we need R&D governance to the extent that we do? Why do we need to assume that people won't want to share their data? Why is information governance so incredibly restrictive that it's very hard to use data that is generated from, for instance, from a healthcare setting? And we also want to challenge what we mean by measures of success, because I think from an academic perspective, from an early career researcher perspective, we often feel that success is the number of publications in high impact journals. And that's the way the system is set up. But that system, dare I say it, reinforces, if you like, a slightly more conservative view to scientific development. You're more likely to get published if you publish something which is a small incremental benefit and what's been published before, rather than something which is truly innovative and something that might actually take the field in a different direction, which may be the right direction scientifically and otherwise. So the next part, I just having thought about those things and reflected on those things and tried to impart some deep cynicism, I think it's also maybe worthwhile to like I say, have my bird's eye view of where I think the future for dementia and brain health research is going. So for those who've worked with me, for those who know me, they'll know that my main research interest is in developing new knowledge from cohort studies in people in midlife who are maybe at varying degrees of risk of developing dementia. And what that was, that sort of direction of travel was originally based on the assumption that Alzheimer's disease was a disease of midlife that developed and progressed to a point where someone developed dementia in late life. Now, that was an assumption that needed to be shown empirically with data, that there were changes in the brain, there was expressions of disease that could be measured in people decades before dementia developed. So if the prediction for what we see in the future around dementia and brain health is that early disease, neurodegenerative disease takes place in midlife, then what this requires in the future is mechanisms for early detection, mechanisms for risk prediction, mechanisms on understandings of how best to communicate risk to individuals, so dare say we don't do harm. And of course, the other key element to this is, and of course I speak from a clinical perspective, is we have to ensure there are service developments that wrap around these new abilities. And I'll come back to this later, but I think we've also got to think outside the box about whether or not this is just the remit of the doctor, the nurse, the healthcare practitioner, or are there other actors and agencies that need to be involved in healthcare, rather than, as we often joke, the NHS should actually be called the National Illness Service and not the National Health Service, as there are other communities and settings and corporations and entities which are dedicated to healthcare, who are not necessarily anything to do with the NHS. So the implications of this initial observation or prediction, I thought I'd break down by theme. Now, there's some of these themes I'm more comfortable with than others because of my own research background, but I thought I'd give it a go anyway. So this is the only real sort of figure or cartoon I have, but it just sort of helped illustrate what I've just been saying. This is how, for decades, to be honest, we've considered Alzheimer's disease. We've seen it through what we call the peephole of the dementia syndrome. And necessarily what that means is we've only really done empirical scientific inquiry in older people who have a dementia syndrome or very close to developing one. Well, I often say, for those who've attended lectures of mine before, it's almost like trying to understand a pregnancy by only speaking to the mother or examining the mother a week before the baby's born and trying to assume what happened early in the course of the pregnancy. And when we do that, we necessarily see the patient through the symptoms that they've developed, be they cognitive symptoms, functional symptoms, behavioural symptoms, what have you. And interestingly, over the years, we've almost abandoned the whole concept of this being a brain disease. If one looks at the way we diagnose dementia currently, in the diagnostic criteria, there's no reference to the brain. You don't need to do neuroimaging, you don't need to measure any biomarkers. It is simply all based on what we call phenomenology. Now that we've had the ability, or we have had the ability for 20 or 30 years to actually look into what the brain is doing, or in terms of thinking, symptoms, function, behaviors, but also more importantly, we've been able to enhance that by looking at what it actually does from a biological perspective with neuroimaging, CSF, blood-based biomarkers in the future. We should be shifting our gaze earlier, and we're doing this with, like I say, the cohort studies. If we do that, and when we do that, or as we do that, then we're going to have a greater priority towards other measures, other cognitive measures perhaps, patient-related outcome measures become increasingly important, We have to be reminded that when we do things from a clinical perspective, we're doing it for the benefit of the person, what their values are, what their expectations are, what their hopes are from an intervention. We're not treating the memory test, we're not treating the biomarker, we're working with a person to improve their quality of life and well-being. But perhaps the greatest emphasis on this new change, as it is in every other branch of medicine in some ways, is that we recognize early disease by biomarkers. So one could argue that we recognize the risk factors for heart disease and for stroke through high levels of cholesterol and high blood pressure. These are biological markers of risk factors for disease if left untreated will develop into quite serious outcomes. So this is a new way I think we have to be thinking, and this is a direction of travel definitely over the next few years. Okay, so what are the implications? Now in each of the next 5 slides, by the way, I'm going to show you a photograph of the Scottish landscape, and at the end there's a little quiz to see if you can recognise where they are. But anyway, implications. So from a fundamental science perspective, and again I'm probably going to be a bit controversial here, the focus, I've not been in a lab for like ever, so I've got to be very careful what I say here. But from a fundamental science perspective, I think what we should be trying to do is working on the complex relationships mechanistically that take place early in the disease course. Now, how we do that, that's up for grabs. We have got access in Scotland, particularly to incredible resources in terms of very deeply phenotyped cohorts with a lot of biological samples available that can be analysed to look at proteomic, genomic, metabolomic interactions with clinical phenotypes and risk factors. So we should be able to drill down onto what those mechanisms, and the longitudinal samples as well. We should be able to drill down onto what those complex interactions are from a fundamental science perspective. But the driver for this, and this is where I'm probably going to get into trouble, is forget about drugs. The drivers for this is actually better detection. How I think we've got the cart in front of the horse. We've been trying to develop drugs for diseases we don't fully understand. Now, one could argue we could have our cake and eat it. We could develop drugs and use them from an experimental medicine perspective to help. If we perturbed a mechanism of disease and we saw an impact or an output or an outcome that was important, then you're learning something about the mechanism. But that's not what we're doing with drugs at the moment. What we're doing with drugs at the moment is trying to provide clinical therapeutics rather than experimental medicine intervention. So I think what I'd much rather see is a focus on diagnostic markers, early detection markers that we can then use to identify early disease processes, which will gear us towards personalized medicine, and then we can start working on drug development. The implications when we think about diagnosis and detection is to translate complex and costly interventions into globally accessible tests. Everybody knows that dementia is a global problem, and we know that the numbers of people developing dementia and they're in neurodegenerative diseases is actually going to have a much greater impact in low and middle income countries. And the main risk factors for neurodegenerative disease actually accumulate in people from more deprived socioeconomic backgrounds. So it's a complete disconnect if we were to develop diagnoses and detection methodologies that could only be applied in 0.00001% of the population. So we need to give consideration when we're developing diagnostic tests and means of detecting disease that they can be used effectively and accurately in all parts of society all over the world. My next point from diagnosis and detection, and again this is probably where I really get into trouble, is that we have to think, like I said at the beginning, that Alzheimer's disease and neurodegenerative diseases are not cognitive disorders, they're brain diseases. Now we've been measuring these brain diseases over the last 100 years through cognitive behavioural tests because we couldn't get access to the brain. Those days are past now, and there's no reason to think about these conditions as cognitive disorders, just as we shouldn't think about cancers as nausea disorders or pain disorders. They're diseases that are defined by the tissue type of the cancer. So I think we have to fundamentally rethink the way we conceptualize Alzheimer's disease as a brain disease, not a cognitive disorder. And one of the things I think I find most challenging is that for people who are developing new technologies, new applications, new apps to try and early identification, early detection of brain disease, they're just in some ways different ways of testing the same thing, which is cognition. I would much prefer that we were directing our attention to looking at other biomarkers, and one that I've mentioned there is speech. I think the way we speak, how we speak, the type of conversations we have, the content of our speech, these are things with artificial intelligence and other aligned approaches. I think we can really begin to understand what is happening in the brain through speech much earlier in the course of disease. So, when we speak to, I'm going to say Alexa in a minute, she's going to turn on. When we speak to Alexa in the future, she may actually direct us to further testing because of how we speak to her in terms of early detection. And of course, with all of these new tests and all of these new mechanisms for detecting early disease, we have to obviously give a lot of thought to how we communicate the individual's risk of developing something in the future. Now, people often say to me, well, what's the point of doing all this when there's no treatment? And that's where I really do bang my head against the desk and say, what do you mean there's no treatment? They say, well, there's no drug. And I say, well, who cares? Because we know from the Lancet Commission report that lifestyle interventions and modifying comorbidities and other factors may have a dramatic impact in the course of disease. We don't understand why that may have an impact in the course of disease, but epidemiologically, it seems to be the case. And it's also a very paternalistic view to take on the world. If somebody presents to you and says, look, I'm worried about my brain health, I'm worried about some symptoms, I'm worried about my risk because my parents both had it, who is it to then turn them away and say, well, there's no drug for it, come back in 5 years once it's deteriorated or not, as the case may be? If people are asking a question, I think it's our responsibility to try and answer it as accurately as possible. So that leads on to prevention, the area I'm probably most involved in personally. What are the implications for the future? Well, we've developed cohort studies now that are primarily recruiting people in midlife, 40 to 59-year-olds in the Prevent Dementia study, EPAD, European Prevention of Alzheimer's, the over 50s. And what we're actually beginning to see already in those studies is that even in the Prevent Dementia cohort, where the mean age is 53, we're beginning to see changes in the brain which seem to be compensating for something that came earlier. So one direction of travel may be to do neurodegenerative disease cohorts in the under 40s to really map out what those early changes are, maybe the interface between neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative, which takes place maybe as early as your 20s or your 30s. We thought we were going young when we went to 40, but it may be the case that in the future we'll have to develop some neurodegenerative or neuroscience cohorts in people much younger than 40. The other key direction of travel is that cohort studies inherently have biases in terms of who's recruited into the project. And what we have to do is work out how to collect data from the real world, where, dare say, people actually live, with a multiplicity of comorbidities, socioeconomic problems, cultural diversity, language diversity, because it's only then you get this sort of ecological validity from the science you're developing that can be more rapidly translated and implemented in clinical practice or in public health practice. The other big ticket item at the moment is data interoperability. Technicians and engineers who are experts in data science are really looking at ways of bringing together data sets from all over the world into platforms where researchers can then use those data to explore hypotheses between data sets. It may be that we aggregate data sets into one large data set, or it may be probably more valid from a statistical perspective to test in one and then replicate and reproduce in another data set to give you that assurance that your findings are valid. I've said before that doctors make the worst academics. That's because we like binary outcomes. We don't like the uncertainty and the sort of, not uncertainty, but we don't like answers, if you like, that change constantly. And from an artificial intelligence machine learning perspective, as we gather more and more data on outcomes, for instance, from real world databases, our risk prediction algorithms, what will happen to an individual, will constantly be updated, reinformed, recalculated, and then represented to the clinician. Now, what's happening in the back end, it doesn't really need to bother the clinician who's using these information or the patient who's having it communicated to them. I mean, every time we do a new order with Amazon, Amazon updates our profile and knows more about us. And the same should be true of using artificial intelligence when we're using real-world data to inform a better estimate of the future for any given individual. The other thing about prevention is, and I think this is something we need to really think hard about from an SDRC perspective, is are we engaging the right community of academics? I know that our primary care physicians, GPs, who are members of the consortium, but I do think that we maybe need to sort of look more towards those areas, those domains of research in public health and primary care. Ultimately, that's where prevention takes place, not in secondary and tertiary care. So I know I've got about 10 minutes to go, so I've got just a couple more slides. Living well theme, incredibly productive theme within the consortium. In fact, more academic publications than any of the other themes. Unfortunately, less research income, and that's something that we obviously have to try and address. But the living well theme also extends itself back into not just living well with dementia, but could in the future think more about living well with at-risk status and what that means. There's obviously a huge amount of work to do. I mentioned the Lancet Commission report and how the epidemiological findings are pointing towards modifiable risk factors, modifiable in inverted commas, because what we have to work out is how do we work with the individual to recognize the importance of the salience of that risk factor to them in terms of their risk of developing dementia and help them to make modifications to it, which can be incredibly hard if we're talking about, you know, lifestyle, nutrition, diet, exercise. And once they've made those modifications with us, then how can we help them to be sustained so that we do have an impact on their life course risk of developing dementia later on. There's also, we did an Ipsos Murray poll within Brain Health Scotland just recently, where we showed that in people under the age of between the ages of 20 and 40, 1,000 people were surveyed across Scotland, published a report on the Brain Health Scotland website. But it suggested that 75% of people were as concerned or as aware of their brain health as they were about cancer or heart disease. But yet only 25% knew of anything they could do to affect that. So there's a big gap between awareness of brain health as a key issue for well-being and knowledge about what one can do to maintain brain health. So this is something which I think is something we need to work on. And when we develop new clinical services and new public health services and bring in different agencies to help on this sort of healthcare journey for prevention, then we need to be continually doing service research using models like theory of change to continually be updating and adapting our service models to be optimized for the well-being of the people who are using them. So the final theme within SDRC is informatics. Where do I think this is going? Okay, clearly we're going to be using apps to monitor and to maybe diagnose and detect early stages of brain disease. But again, I've said before, I emphasize that the key biomarker in my mind is speech. And I think that would be a key area that people may wish to think about moving into if they're not already. From an informatics perspective, I mentioned the data platforms that are being developed by Bill Gates through a channel called the Alzheimer's Disease Data Interoperability Platform, ADDI, but there's also, and has been for many years, Dementia's Platform UK. So these big data ecosystems are going to be engineered for the future. And I think, to be honest, over the next maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years, there is going to be a huge amount of activity around secondary data analysis. If I were to think about where the most resources are going to be going, where the most PhD studentships are going to be, where the most postdoctoral fellowships are going to be, I do think at this stage it's going to be using and exploring the data that we've already collected rather than necessarily new data collection. The new data sources for informatics, I think, might come from unusual places. I mentioned Amazon. We might find that detecting early brain disease might come from GPS data. It might come from shopping behaviors. It might come from Google searches. there are other ways of detecting changes in an individual's behaviour beyond doing an ADAS call or an R-bands. And I think these are new territories which I think could be exploited to try and help detect disease as early as possible. From an informatics perspective, this is more of sort of a governance statement. And this is the first time I mentioned my other hobby of quantum physics. But quantum physics, one of the basic tenets about wave-particle duality, how a particle can be a wave and have solid particle-like behaviours at the same time. And I get so frustrated about working in clinical practice and somebody going, oh, that's research. And then you're working on your research and you have to go through every hoop known to mankind to be able to do something to a patient that you would do normally in a clinic, but you have to go through X, Y, and Z to be able to do it from a research perspective. And I just think to really move things forward, we have to completely shake up this kind of disconnect between clinical practice and research. How we do that, I'm not so sure, but I think we have to, really work hard to think about new ways of doing this in the future. And I also, and I apologise to my colleagues, my inferential statistic colleagues, but I do think that machine learning will be the way that we will use these big data sets in the future, rather than necessarily using more traditional inferential statistics. So I think this might be my penultimate slide. So the major shifts and the needs that arise as a consequence. So disease before dementia, I think that's something that is now secure. I don't think there's anybody doubts that anymore, and that then should open up a whole new set of inquiries and the implications I've mentioned previously. I think in some ways we also have to help people understand that doing a PhD or doing postdoctoral work doesn't only have to lead someone to be a senior lecturer and a professor. And there is huge value in terms of research and development to taking forward non-academic careers to, in effect, like reward the engineers, the operations people who, in some ways, and I know this from experience, actually have a greater impact on delivery than actually the scientific basis that maybe emerged from the academic. So I think there's a need to really value all different avenues that an individual could travel after they've done their PhD or their postdoctoral work. I think there's a desperate need to engage new actors in the system with different profits. Now, what do I mean by that? There might be fellowships awarded, there might be partnerships developed. Traditionally, they've been, dare say it, with the drug companies and by the standard funding agencies. But who's to say that in the future that David Lloyd Gyms might want to put together a fellowship about brain health, or Google or Microsoft, to try and answer some of these questions? So, and I know that this happens a lot already, but I think it's trying to really expand those connections around a disease area. So there's a lot of collaborations academically with tech industry, of course there are, but they tend to be not necessarily focused on a clinical condition like dementia or brain health issues. So I think this is something that we have to go out and look for different partnerships, not just the drug companies, not just the standard funding agencies. I've got no solution to this other than to beg the question, or to keep almost saying this isn't necessarily acceptable. But how do we enable R&D structures to actually, how do we create R&D structures where we're actually enabling the knowledge generation rather than, I feel, often inhibiting? And I say that as a former R&D director from a mental health trust in West London, where as an R&D director, my only goal was to help the researchers to get their work done as efficiently as possible. Now, I'd imagine every R&D director in the country would say exactly the same thing, but I found that the systems were broken. So although our motivations may have been to encourage researchers and to develop, their pipelines and their academic outputs, we were working in ways that didn't actually work with us. They fundamentally worked against us. And these are big national discussions we have to have. I often think, and those who work with me hear me talk about this, why do we have ethics committees? If you look at the mandate of ethics committees, it's often said to protect the patient or protect the participant. And I'm thinking, well, what are they protected from? Are they being protected from the researcher? Are they being protected from the intervention? Are they protected from... And I think one way around this could be, why don't we have a passport? Why don't you, as a senior researcher who's been in front of an ethics committee 10, 15, 20, 30 times with no issues, have an ethics passport, where means you don't need to go to an ethics committee anymore. You can obviously do your paperwork, but you can get automatic approval, like a little sort of stamp in your book saying, and of course you could be audited, you could be called into question, but it would just smooth things so quickly to be able to get on and do the science rather than waiting forever to get through the system. And the other thing, which again might be controversial, but I think is maybe worth debating, is data, healthcare data. Now, accessing healthcare data, which, as we know, there's absolutely huge, vast amounts of data on individuals, particularly in Scotland, where we've got a very, very good health informatics system, linked through the CHI number. But to be able to access those data, I've got a PhD student who wanted to access just some drug data, took almost a year and a half to get that data. And the reason being that one has to go through various information governance steps. Now, I wonder, for instance, if people are, I'm going to tread very carefully how I say this, but if people are using the NHS, which is free at the point of access, could we have a social contract with those individuals to say, we will do all that we can from a medical, from a clinical, from a nursing, from a psychology perspective to help you with your issue. And in return, we would like unfettered access to all the data generated without needing your consent. The consent would be that the contract between the NHS and the individual is we provide you with care, but you allow us access to your data for research. Because at the end of the day, the research, putting it bluntly, doesn't care about the individual. It only cares about the patterns that one sees between groups of individuals related to different socioeconomic, biological, and other factors. If we were to do that, then we'd unlock this huge reservoir of knowledge and information that would make a fundamental difference to the next patient that comes along with the same condition. Now, when I've done clinical research for however many years, the one thing that binds all of the research participants together is a sense of altruism. The sense that by doing something in research, they can make it better in the future for people who may have the same condition as them or their parents. And often it's the case that I don't want my child to have the same condition as me. So there's a huge sense of altruism. And I think if we had conversations with the public about how we use data to improve the future well-being of generations to come, I can't imagine many people would say no to allowing researchers to access their data in an unfettered, almost instantaneous way, rather than the systems we have in place now, which are costly and inhibit knowledge generation and get people stuck in terms of developing new treatments or detection technologies. And from an early career researcher perspective, I also think we need to support risk-taking and offer long-term contracts. I think going between short-term, fellowships and the like is actually advantageous to the institution employing rather than the individual being employed. And I would like to see maybe at a postdoctoral level, people being given very long-term contracts by universities. Now, of course, the flip side of that is there has to be performance management, there has to be ways of ensuring that an individual with a long-term contract still contributes. But I do think we should put trust and faith in the individual to do that, rather than having this kind of attrition through highly risky grant applications, because it's very demotivating, as we know, gives no job security, and acts as a major disincentive to people joining the academic and research communities. So I'm going to stop there. I've got no idea how much chat or how much vitriol is being thrown at me at the moment for some of the comments I've made. What I'd like to do just before we maybe open up the last 5 minutes of discussion is those were the sort of 5 scenes. So I'm not going to ask people to shout out, but you can maybe write down where you think they are in Scotland. So top left, that's Schiehallion, looking towards Ranach Moor. Such a beautiful country, such a lovely landscape. Number 2 may be slightly easier. That's the Isle of Skye, looking towards the Coolins. The third one is Invergary, looking south to the Nevis Range. By the way, these are all photos I took over the summer. Well, bottom right, not the summer, that was last October. Number 4 is Anachmore, and then in the background behind Anachmore is Fort William. And then finally, that's the southern slope of Loch Nagar and Loch Mech. So if you got 2 or 3 of those, well done. If you got all 5, absolutely brilliant. So I will stop there, stop sharing my screen, and